Hi, my name is Nick. Last year I wrote a visual novel called Loner Dog that won first place in its jam out of over 200 entries. I want to talk to you today about how I generally write my beginnings and endings to stories when I write my own scripts. So enjoy! So most conventional advice will tell you to write your beginning at the ending of your writing process. This is for a plethora of reasons, and it has a lot of overlap with why you should write structured and non-fiction texts like that as well. It makes sense, right? Like once you've written your piece, you know what's in it, what you should build towards, and what lends itself in creating an effective introduction to your story, setting characters, your major plot points, your themes, everything that your story revolves around. Especially if you're a discovery writer like me and you only really know the shape of your story after you've written it, this is like the obvious and natural solution to the question of when and how you should write your beginning. But that's mostly if you don't already have a strong vision, which is like a little spoiler for a topic we'll cover in like a few minutes. So this video is kind of meant for like newer writers, because I feel, and like people have told me that like for newer writers, it's like difficult to figure out how or where, and when to like end a story and also begin a story. And both of these things have always come fairly too easy, even when I was only starting out with writing. So this is what this video is about, basically. I cannot and don't want to give you a one-size-fits-all approach in this video. Not to game writing, not for story writing, not for anything. Because like I don't even have an established like writing process and procedure. It varies from project to project. And what I do want to provide you with is a look into my workflows, since those are workflows that have produced works that you may be already know and like the endings of or not, and beginnings. Keep saying only endings. They're workflows that have grown on me, and they work for me, and so maybe this is something that you can take with you going forward. All right, let's go. So let's start with beginnings. The first type of beginning that I want to talk about is a vision-driven ending. Beginning. Why do I keep saying ending? God fucking damn it. So sometimes you just start out with like a hella strong vision for how you should start your game. Or you have this like morsel of characterization for one of your favorite characters that you wrote or that you want to write that you just definitely want to open with. This was almost exactly the case for She Was Swallowed by the Sun and definitely for The Death of Harsh Noise. In my 2024 Yuri visual novel, She Was Swallowed by the Sun, I had this like very concrete vision. It was to open with Anhedonia, picking up one from prison. This is something that I kind of written from day one. It had been just in my mind. I had been floating these girls for like a few months already before I started writing. And so by the time I got to writing, they were already pretty fleshed out. The only issue was that when I first read through that opening, I felt like it was too slow and meandering. And also not that engaging actually, because it has a lot of like implicit and underlying questions that you have no sensible like point of reference for. And so I changed the opening slightly so that there's like, I don't know, like 200 word a prologue before that, where you see one being inside the prison, and that contextualizes the prison pickup scene, which is much longer and actually full of characterization, much more, because like one doesn't really talk in the opening because she's getting tortured, you know. And then we get to the actual opening, right? Like I knew the vibe, I knew their shtick, I knew the fate of these girls, which again we'll talk about more in the ending section. And at the time, I wanted to portray like anarchist and anti-colonial struggles as they have occurred in history a bit, or like at least take some inspiration from them. Like so many historical revolutionary figures had been imprisoned over the course of their lives, and it felt appropriate that the protagonists of this game, which are very similar goals to that, also have already had their run-in with the local authorities. And I wanted to combine that with like a lovey-dovey reunion outside the correctional facility. Also because I wanted to portray the other themes and already like lay the groundwork there. Like we have their love for one another, the context of the society that they live in, the environments that surrounds them, right? Like you have this like blasted landscape, and just like this desolate, barren wasteland with like dead trees and everything, which is also just like an important bit of like scene building. I think on a technical side here, like for a quick diversion into Godot, I also used like a little like shader to animate the grass swaying. And I didn't use it much beyond that first opening, but I think it adds like a nice ambience to the scene as well. Then for the Death of Harsh Noise, I wrote a few scenes and character concepts before writing the beginning. But if you don't know, Harsh Noise is the direct sequel to Loner Dog, which is a game I wrote a year ago. And in the meantime, I had also written 2 more games in that same setting. So it wasn't like a complete blank canvas thing. Those characters had already have such strong characterization that I wrote those first few words and I just knew that they had to remain that way until the end of the development process, right? I still remember the first time I masturbated to the picture of a corpse is a powerful set of words to just cold open a story with. It is also more character driven than the opening in She Was Swallowed by the Sun. Here, the words are spoken directly by Harsh Noise and not the narrator voice, as we have in She Was Swallowed by the Sun. This also limits the scope to the personal experiences of Harsh Noise, and it presents you with all the subject matter that you kind of need to know to be able to interface with the story, which is like online necrophilic communities and such. These 2 games were examples of like the first type of opening that I usually write. Like when I know what my characters already roughly are, I can use that knowledge to frame them in a way that serves to prime the reader into the direction of the story. It also gives me like a narrative Rosetta Stone, kind of. Like if I need to reorient myself as I'm writing the story, I can just look at the like groundwork, at the foundations that are already laid at the beginning of development, and I can look at what the story already did up until that point to like inform my decisions of the story going forward. But obviously, this also generalizes to having reference stories, scenes, plot beats, characters, interactions in general. Like the more you have like this kind of like field of stars that you can look at of like, oh, these are the different interactions that I want these characters to have, the more informed you can make the decisions of where to write your story next to. Now for beginning type 2, the iterative beginning. The second kind of beginning is much more nebulous to talk about, and that's the iterative opening, right? This technique means that you write your story and you keep coming back to your opening over and over again. You switch it out, you rewrite it, you cut it entirely, etc., etc., etc. For me, this is usually the case when I'm not super set on the direction of the story in the beginning. Like I wrote Loner Dog, like that, for instance. With openings like these, we're close to the advice I talked about in the beginning of the video. The more of the script that you have done, the more you know what you need to put into the beginning to get the reader up to speed and give them all the info that they need to get started and invested in the story. One method of iteration that I here quickly want to highlight is to just like chop off the first 1 or 2 scenes of the script after a few weeks of writing. I cannot stress enough how useful this technique has been to my own writing process, especially if you yourself feel like your script just feels a little bit off or sluggish. Just delete the first few scenes and see how it feels. This has helped me a whole bunch in the past. There's still in like the script files of the Loner Dog project, there's still some remnants of like those first few lines that I wrote, and I just felt like they were too non-specific and too meandering to really like be appropriate to the tone of the game. I also have the feeling that more inexperienced writers struggle with openings because there's so much information that you have in your head about your world, about your characters that you want your readers to know. And that is fine. However, the information also does not matter, actually. Something that I did over and over in various projects and scripts is to look at the script again after a few weeks of development, and then when I wrote and when I deleted those scenes, those first few scenes, like 500 or 2000 words had been gone, and the script was just like better that way. It has better momentum then. The reason for that is because you, as a writer, you need to know everything that you can about the world, I think. However, the reader does not. Every scene that you cut also informs your own internal view of your world and your characters, but those small missing bits of information and those small gaps are really juicy for your readers because it creates tension and engagement, and they can fill in the blanks with their own internal assumptions about the world and their own personal experiences, which makes those gaps more impactful and personal. It's a balance that you have to strike between omitting like a few details or just like confusing the reader because you don't give them enough information. You know, when you write really meandering openings, the issue is usually that you put in a bunch of words and information that are actually not that relevant for the reader to get invested in the story. The second advantage to this approach is that it kind of treats the reader with more respect, I feel, because they can think about the world themselves. You don't need to be told explicitly why a story opens with a character shooting up heroin. Like, you can deduce a lot about the world and their own personality from that act alone. It's that basic show don't tell thing. Here, in specific, leveraging what your audience probably knows or doesn't know is the way to make the story feel like it's in conversation with the life and the experiences of the reader. This is why it can be like important or like useful to think about your target audience, even if it is like a very marketing-y thing to do. Doing this obviously has ramifications for the tone and pacing and feel of your story. It naturally makes things snappier, more in medias res, and also less accessible on the knowledge side, though it is more accessible on the attention span side. The worlds feel more lived in and alive then, when it doesn't feel like you're reading a history book that feels like info dumping a bunch of facts on you. I think most games at large struggle with this because they tend to open with setups like 50 years ago. The big dark evil entered our world and things went bad, and now a lone group of survivors is struggling for survival, and you are one of them, and now go. And that is like so boring and irrelevant. Like, who gives a shit? We can even look at IRL examples of this. Like, I live in Germany. So in 1989, like 12 years before I was born, the Berlin Wall fell. And that definitely impacted how I grew up. Because I'm not growing up in the GDR. You know, that's not that, like, that is very much still alive history. But I'm currently only 25, so, like, it's actually not relevant to my existence at all because it didn't happen within my lifetime. I never knew a world that is different from this. And my more immediate problems that your reader can probably also relate to more, right? It's like, my friends don't have enough money. They have too much mental illness, and there's fascists on the rise everywhere. Even at the most zoomed out, if you wanted to write about my life currently, you'd have to talk about like how I'm going to pick up HRT at like my local pharmacy. Also, there's the general societal pressures of, I hope that's still accessible in like a few years. Who knows? Right? And then I text like a few friends and they're having like mental health crash outs that are also extremely existentially threatening on a more relatable level. The way that you hook a player in, I think, or reader, is by giving them more immediate problems to attach themselves to. I don't need to understand your elaborate fantasy monster lore to know that bleeding out on the battlefield is bad. But on the next shot, then you can show your cool fantasy monster roaming in the background and eating my comrades, and oh no, that's scary now. Now you have more immediate issues, but that's not, but you know, fantasy monsters are not the thing that's gonna be like, oh shit, that's relatable to me type deal, you know? Okay, so what I want to discuss as groundwork of endings is the point of endings in general, especially if you're more fandom brained than people who always want like a rundown of like all of the full reasons of why something or anything happens. A full arc, nothing left unexplored, everything laid bare. If you are a writer, for the love of fuck, do not adhere to this philosophy. Endings serve one purpose only: to provide a sense of closure, emphasis on sense. You do not need to reach a full logical story conclusion for the narrative to be able to conclude your work. You have to give the reader the feeling that whatever they just read is done saying all the things it wanted to say. And obviously, you can play with and subvert this purpose when you get more experienced. For general purpose advice, however, a good benchmark can be: what are the remaining questions of the story at large? And do all of them pale in comparison to the rest of the story, to the context of the ending, to the specific thing that you're ending on? If yes, then congratulations, you have a fully competent ending. This is why, like, death and apocalypse and escape and all of those very radical things are all such trivial and common types of endings. If you cannot find a way to tie up a thread, you can consider cut it entirely from the story, or you just render it obsolete by increasing the narrative weight tenfold. Some general affirmations for this as well. Like, you can leave open questions. You don't have to resolve every character arc. You can even end on a character falling even deeper into their own misery and then just cut to black. Whatever the last scene is that you have before the credits roll will be the one to linger in the general memory. Of your reader, or that is more likely to linger in the memory of your reader, because there won't be any additional input coming after that point. And so, considering the emotional and narrative tone of that pace, and the pace of that story beat, of that final story beat, is really important. And just like with beginnings, I have approached endings in different ways. The first type of ending is the targeted ending. Sometimes you just know what your story is gonna end with. For the Myopia V ends, when the she received the sky and she was swallowed by the sun, that was the case for both of them. And when the sea received the sky, I deliberately wanted to write a visual novel that served as a prequel, or like just not less of a direct prequel, but just like a general visual novel to set the atmosphere of Myopia. Myopia itself is a rage platformer that I made with a friend, and also Noise Jam co-host, Entropy, in 2022. When I wrote the lore bits for that game, like in the game you can find these small bits of text, I wrote those. When I wrote those, I had this vision in my mind of like these two scientist girls in their underground lab, shrouded in darkness and cables and screens. And I wanted to aim at building up that atmosphere and that feeling in When the Sea Received the Sky. That is, in a very concrete example, what Zero's workshop became. I knew the world had already ended, right? All that was left for me to do was to write a doomed Yuri narrative that led to that end. In She Was Swallowed by the Sun, the vision for the ending came to me at a concert, and I just carried it with me for months. I talk about that more in the artist statement and postmortem of She Was Swallowed by the Sun. And then with the opening scene also being fairly set, all that was left to do was for me to write a bunch of like sex scenes and some like cool other plot stuff to fuse those sex scenes so that everything felt satisfying to read. And I regularly thought about how to best serve the ending and to build up the catastrophe with like increasing stakes across the different chapters of the game, basically. The second type of endings is the emergent type of ending. This can be like very daunting to talk about or like to consider, but it is also very doable actually. So let me emphasize, you do not need an ending to begin writing. Both with Loner Dog and Dog Days, I did not know how those stories were gonna end when I set up the project and began writing the first few scenes and character concepts. I talk about that at length in the Loner Dog postmortem, If you're interested, like I'm gonna have all of these down in the description links. But I basically flew blind for 3 weeks before an ending started to crystallize. Sometimes you just have to delude yourself into thinking that you are the greatest writer ever and that the answers for all of your narrative problems are just gonna come to you in time, and I can maybe promise you that they will. Probably. This is a type of ending that is more fitting for discovery writers like me, I think. You can have trust in yourself and your characters, and that in this entire process, that as you continue to write the characters' internals and their conflicts, that the core conflict and the core themes of the story will emerge. Or you will find some ending beat that satisfyingly ties all of the different narrative threads that you laid out together. For this, you have to be able to write the first few drafts of scenes with nothing but the raw characters and world building to guide you, or to guide themselves for you if you dabble in a bit of tulpamancy, and then just let it rest. Like on that last point, I regularly have moments where my characters feel very alive and like they're in conversation with me and their own narrative processes. And then when you stitch on more scenes down the road, you will be then able to tighten the narrative on what you wrote previously. And that also extends towards the ending. It is just the discovery writer process expanded onto the ending as well. I also want to talk about pacing, in that it is fine to write an ending, and then once you've written it, you decide that it just takes too long to arrive, or maybe it is too sudden. In those cases, if you're satisfied with the ending, you can just cut or add some other scenes to further feed into whatever you're going for with the ending. And again, if you feel like your script feels sluggish at parts, do not be afraid to just read through the script but omit a few scenes. It takes maybe 10 minutes to test read scenes like that. Like you just take a scene and you take out the preceding scene or the scene following it, and then you just read through that. And like all of these surrounding scenes, you don't have to read through the entire script. And it is the best way to test if that reshuffling works. The same goes for when your script begins contradicting itself, or when the order in which you reveal information to the reader is becoming kind of nonsensical. I very regularly move just big chunks of my scripts to different positions to feel how the exposition of information then begins to flow. Depending on your tools, you might have some really trivial way of even just like skipping parts of the script, like commenting out a passage in code or something, without having to like risk permanently like screwing up your script. In general, use version control, obviously, if you're writing visual novels or like other digital stories. And so with that, we can come to the conclusion of this video. There is no singular right or wrong way to write your beginnings and endings. Like all things game dev, it like heavily depends. But some pointers that I want to give to you now is that for beginnings, you can have a strong opening in mind and work off of that, and that becomes your writing process's guiding star. You can back solve the opening from whatever strong narrative threads you weave down the road, and you write that to serve as the perfect on-ramp. As a bit of advice, I would implore you to just cut one or two scenes from the beginning of your script a few weeks into the writing process and see how it feels, and then go from there. For endings, you can envision an ending and then write a cascade of events that build up to that ending. You can write blindly and trust that your characters will emerge with their own narrative arcs that you can then tie together. And in general, I think you should grow comfortable with the idea of writing scenes only for the scene's sake at first, and then tie it all into like a satisfying ending and like coherent story later. And in general, just be eager to cut or reorder your scenes or experiment with daunting and unintuitive plot arrangements. You might find something really stimulating, and ideally, it's not that big of a cost on development. And that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any other thoughts on the topic or you have any more questions, please leave them down in the comments. If there's like enough material there, I might even just like make a follow-up video, who knows. If you want to support work like this, I also have a link to my Patreon down in the comments. You can subscribe, you can play my games for free on it, and I'll love to see you all around. And until next time,